Don't read anything about it. Don't cheat. Remember, we're trying to practice reading poetry and reading narrative poetry as we see it, and allowing us ourselves to experience it, and not search for the easy answers. Almost every poem that we've looked at thus far, we've been able to really comb through, right? So here we are, Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still, above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless, breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? How can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? What do you guys think? What do we think? Shall we read it again? Let's read it again. And try doing it this time. Look at the text and read it under your breath as I read it. Okay? Try this. A sudden blow. The great wings beating. Still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Leda and the Swan. So what do we think? What is this poem about? What is the poem about? Okay, we have Leda and the Swan. Leda and the Swan. So I want to hear from you guys. What do we think is happening here? What actions are being described in this poem? Yeah, you can just call out. Sure. Yeah, okay. There's something going on. The swan is descending upon Leda. So, what do you think? Okay, it's quite physical. A lot of the words are very physical. Beating, staggering, dark. What's the feel of the poem? Is it good? Mm-hmm. Helpless, terrified, vague, loosening, rush, strange heart beating, shudder, engenders, broken wall, burning, Agamemnon dead. So caught up. Blood of the air. What do we think is happening? So what's the mood? What's the feel of the poem? Is it a happy poem? No.
It's not happy, but it's more of, I think for me, the swan is a representation where we're saving the girl.
Okay, so we're getting saving here. Okay, so saving is,
Or something that's
okay, saving is positive.
stopping later to die or to in that.
Okay? Okay? I'm interested how the women read this poem. Leda is a woman. Well, her pronouns are her here. Okay. It's forceful. It's unwelcome. She is helpless to it. So William Butler Yeats wrote this poem again and again and again and again. He famously wrote and rewrote this poem many times, but finally it appeared in this form, right? So we talk about how poems, and just like the Hebrew Bible there were many iterations of the text before we reach the final shape of the Tanakh, correct? There's multiple iterations, there's addendums, there's additions, and so it is, and you and I had this conversation about Tolkien, about how The Hobbit was written, and he didn't intend it to go into The Lord of the Rings, and many of the stories that would have been in The Hobbit ended up being in The Lord of the Rings, in the 4 books. And so there's a history behind this poem. It was written and rewritten many times before it finally appeared in this form. It appeared for the very first time in a famous collection of William Butler Yeats. It's called The Tower. It was published in 1928. William Butler Yeats at this time was 63. He had written the poem at a much younger age. The Tower was the first book of poems that he released after he had become a Nobel laureate 5 years prior. Yeats is of an exceptionally rare breed of artist who improved in quality as he entered his late life. The poem takes its subject, okay? So this is where we need to know context. Who is Leda and why is there a swan? Is this something that William Butler Yeats made up? Or is he remixing already existing material? Right? Like the flood. Okay, so Agamemnon is who?
From Greek mythology, the son of king and queen. I don't know the name.
So Agamemnon, where does he first appear, Agamemnon? So Agamemnon is a famous Greek general king who fought in the Trojan War. So this is a huge myth, and this Homeric literature. So he's a Homeric hero, right? He fought for the Greeks. He's the ancient son of ancient Greek. Before Greece was Greece, and the united Greece was a country, this was Mycenae. Right? So he is an ancient king, right? And so he is a famous hero, and he was a famous king of Argos, right? If you know who the Argonauts are, this is his kingdom. So, but where does Agamemnon, in any of the literature, where does Agamemnon die? Right? So you see, this is so helpful to understanding how William Butler Yeats is using him in the poem. When did he die? Does Agamemnon die? right? So you need to know the Iliad.
Iliad. He's from Iliad.
Do we know? Don't look it up. So Agamemnon had a wife, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is the daughter of Leda. Okay? So this is our character here. Leda is the mother-in-law. And so Agamemnon dead. So here's where we are. This poem takes its subject from the ancient Greek myth of Leda and the swan. Who is the swan? The swan, okay, so it takes from the Greek mythology the story of Zeus assuming the form of a swan, of the Zeus assuming the form of a swan to seduce Leda, the wife of the Spartan king, who bore from this union Helen of Troy. So this is, right? So this is the Trojan story. So Zeus is interfering with an already bound marriage. And he is attempting to seduce Leda, whose infidelity ignited the Trojan War, right? Helen of Troy ended up being an adulterer and then spawning the Trojan War, right? Upon the great war was fought for Helen of Troy, right? And the beginning of classical history as we know it. But before we explore the way Yeats used the subject, the already existing subject material, to create new meaning, just take a quick look at the actual shape of the poem. There's something unsettling about the form of the sonnet. Okay, this is a sonnet. 4-line, 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 2. Right? So a sudden blow, the great wings beating still, above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed, by the dark webs her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs, and how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there, a broken wall, the burning roof, and a tower, and Agamemnon dead, being so caught up. The form of the sonnet appears to be completely hijacked in the third stanza, right? It's broken. Yeah, the rhyme is broken. It's hijacked, and it's twisted and torn apart like Dr. Frankenstein. Right? Yeats has surgically attached the Shakespearean sonnet with its first 2 quatrains, featuring an A-B-A-B rhyme scheme, with a Petrarchan, an older Greek form of sonnet. A Petrarchan sonnet in the last 6 lines, which is now, so initially you have A, B, right? And then C, D, then C, D. But then when we get to where it should be EF, we don't get EF. We actually get a Frankenstein, like a hodgepodge of a Shakespearean sonnet, which is A, B, right? For 3 quatrains, and then a couplet. But the Petrarchan sonnet is different. It becomes EF, G, E, F, G. So then it becomes GF, it becomes EF, EF, G, and then what? It should be H if it was a Shakespearean sonnet, but it's actually EF and then G. Yeah, so a shudder in the loin engenders there. The broken wall, the burning roof, and Agamemnon dead, but being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air there, did she put on his knowledge and power tower, before the indifferent beak could let her drop up. Right? And so Agamemnon dead and being so caught up, or the break. There is no I. So this is a Petrarchan sonnet. So it's EF, G, EF, G. Yeah, 3 lines and then 4 lines, but that's a Petrarchan sonnet. It's not It's not actually a Shakespearean sonnet, so it doesn't follow that rhyme scheme. So here we are with drop rhymes with up.
Power and power.
Yeah. Yeah, these are called slant rhymes. No, it doesn't count because it's a Petrarchan sonnet, not a Shakespearean sonnet. Yeah. So broken wall, burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead are F. And so this is exactly the unsettlingness of the poem, is that it breaks in form. It breaks in what sounds good to the ear, right? And so what you have is the Petrarchan sonnet in the last 6 line and an EFG rhyme scheme, including the unnerving slant rhyme in Agamemnon dead and being so caught up. That's the slant rhyme. It's both slant rhyme in the rhyme, but also in the form of the lines. And so drop, which robs the final moment of Agamemnon dead of any form of rhyme, it breaks the auditory harmony. And so it breaks closure. So most notable of all of this is line 11. What's line 11? So line 11 is Agamemnon dead, right? Which appears to be the slashed and split in 2. So physically, line 11, which should be Agamemnon dead being so caught up, that should be one line. But in the form of the poem, it's physically slashed. It's physically slashed to break and slant the rhyme. Splitting the closure in 2, leaving the final 3 lines just dangling there, right? Just dangling there. Agamemnon dead, and now the final 3 lines are hanging on being so caught up. Just like Leda herself in the indifferent beak of the swan. And in this way, Yeats commits a kind of violence on the sonnet, right? It creates a kind of violent form of sonnet. Nothing for the poet, not for nothing though, because the poet is attempting to augment the violent content of the work of the sonnet, right? And so, sonnets are what? Typically about what? What are sonnets typically about? They're typically about love, but this is about rape. This sonnet is not about love. It's violently cut in half because it tells the story of Leda's rape by Zeus, right? So traditionally, the sonnet that is about great, undying love of a lover and the beloved, here Yeats uses the sonnet form to describe what could be considered the exact opposite of love, which is the violent rape of Leda. And if you look at the successive versions of Leda and the Swan, you can see that Yeats turned up the volume. Because if you look at the previous versions of this poem, it wasn't as violent as this. He turned up the volume. Here's an early version. A rush, a sudden wheel, and hovering still, the bird descends, her frail thighs pressed by the webbed toes, and that all-powerful bill has laid her helpless face upon his breast. But he upped the volume on the violence and the visceral physicality of this act. If you look at pictures of Leda and the Swan, it's a giant swan with feathers all over the place, and then a helpless little girl. That's the story. And so, for example, in one verse, the poem begins with a rush. A sudden wheel and hovering still, the bird descends, her frail thighs pressed by the webbed toes, and that all-powerful bill has laid her helpless face upon his breast. Now, the early version almost assumes Leda's acquiescence, right? It almost assumes that Leda was allowing it to happen, that she was allowing the gods' advances. In the later version, beginning with the shock of a sudden blow, right? A sudden blow. Zeus's molestation is begun with a hit, a strike. It's intensely emphasized. And emphasized is Leda and the reader's disorientation, a sudden blow, the great wings still beating, right? The ambiguity of beating. What does beating mean? Can be a hit. It's a continuous verb that means to hit, but also could be the wings, just flapping, right? The beating of a wings is the sound that the wings make in the air, but it's ambiguous here. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still.
It's not still as in trump.
Yeah, tranquil, still as in continuously attacking Leda. The ambiguity of beating still. How can wings be still if they're beating? And on the other hand, if he means that they're still beating, that means terrifyingly that what we have entered into in this poem is not a rape after the fact, but a rape as it is happening. It has already begun, and the swan is still in the air, now doing his dirty deed. In this version, the girl is staggering while her thighs are caressed, a word that disturbs us by commingling the sweetness and the kindness and the gentleness of a caress, and the erotic sense of caress, and the vicious something that this swan is doing to Leda. Yeats does a bunch in this poem, caressed by the what? Dark webs. What are dark webs? What are the dark webs? The feet of the swan. The dark webbed feet of the swan. And if you've ever seen a swan attack something, swans are dangerous birds. They're not small, they're big. They can kill a man, actually. If you look up how many people die by swan death a year, it's actually way higher than you'd think it would be. Because swans are very dangerous and they're aggressive because they nurse their young. Right? And so by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. The dark webs gives a sense of just how big this bird is, because it is the webs that are caressing the thigh. Right? Because how big the bird is, because not even the toes are caressing, but it's the webs in between the toes that are caressing. Between the toes are what's caressing her. And it should be noted that both the first and second line end with an enjambment, pulling us awkwardly, right? So the thought carries over the line, right? Above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by, right? So there's a sense that the action is actually bigger than one line can contain, right? Awkwardly through the verse. And it's not until the last line of that verse that we finally get the subject, he. As if everything was so happening so fast that not even Leda knew what was happening. That not even Leda could understand who was doing this. She could not grab her bearings until the gruesome act was already well underway. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. The first quatrain of Leda and the Swan is disturbing in the extreme setting, the scene from Leda as from a horrified point of view. Then we have the second quatrain, which is made up of two rhetorical questions. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? Whose fingers are terrified and vague? It's Leda's. How could these vague and trembling fingers push the glory of this feathered god from her loosening thighs? Right? This quatrain is made up of two rhetorical questions. Both seem to ask the same thing. What could Leda do against the awesome power of a god? How could she possibly resist? How can she do anything but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? These questions can be read in two ways. You can read them rhetorically, which is to say, read them and say, obviously she can't do anything. Such is the tragedy of when a god chooses to act on his own whims, the tragedy of the poem. But I think Yeats invites us to read them a second way, which is to say, what can she do? More on that in a moment. Right? More on that in a moment. This is the moment comes the volta. This is a poem term, a volta. Right? The third stanza comes the volta. A term for when a sonnet turns and questions and the questions or events posed in the first line are answered. So the volta is where the questions in the sonnet are finally addressed. Okay? So the first lines are answered in this case after the shudder, referring both to the moment of the completion of this swan and the latest fear. We have the poet examining the consequences of the rape, and they are really far. They reach really far, right? The broken wall, the burning roof, and the tower, all intimate. All intimate that the rape of Leda not only caused what? Leda to be ravaged, but the Trojan War, right? The full consummation of this complete act led to the birth of Helen of Troy, whose beauty was beyond Aphrodite herself, right? That's why the gods were so involved, because she was a demigod, right? A broken wall, the burning roof, and tower. And if you know Song of Songs, then you know that even these are euphemisms. The broken wall, the burning roof, and the tower, right? Not only did this act cause the rape of Leda and the birth of Helen of Troy, but ensured the eventual destruction of Troy and the rise of Greece and Western history from Homeric legend. It was born out of rape, war, and murder. And Agamemnon dead. Here we have Yeats, his own alteration to the story, because Agamemnon does not die in the Iliad, right? Agamemnon does not die in the Iliad. But this is a sort of a David and Bathsheba moment, right? That Uriah would then be done away with by King David because of what he had done to Bathsheba. In order to avoid the shame and the reckoning, Uriah was sent to the front lines. And so Agamemnon is dead. As the story goes later, Leda laid 2 eggs. One bore Helen and one bore Pollux, which are both demigods, children of Zeus. And then the other egg bore Castor and Clymnestra, the wife of Agamemnon. Right? So Leda would later, after this rape, lay 2 eggs. Pollux and Helen in one egg, and Castor and Clymnestra in another. Leda's mortal husband, Tyndareus, who she laid with the same night, by citing the death of Agamemnon, famously killed by his wife Clymnestra as among the fated ramifications of the rape of Leda, Yeats demonstrates the full effect of the trauma. By doing this, he reaches into the history of art as well, because he calls to Troy and Agamemnon's death. It brings to mind, respectively, Homer's Iliad, the pinnacle of epic form poetry, and Aeschylus's play, the Orestia, the first great work of Western drama that would play in amphitheaters across Greece. All of these allusions are done without ever actually mentioning those works. Simply the act of Agamemnon dead, alludes to both of these, done in 11 words without even mentioning the works. And then the continued sexual overtones, broken wall, the tower. Then Yeats concludes the poem with one final question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? And to understand this and the poem itself in its larger context, we have to know a little bit more about Yeats and his way of thinking from his early life. Yeats had always been drawn to mysticism and astrology and to the occult. Many people thought that Yeats was some form of warlock. It was a thing that they would say because he was so interested in these mythological tellings and in the occult of the Middle Ages. So in doing so, he developed his own complex metaphysic and cosmic system, which he laid out in extreme detail in a book he called A Vision. One of the key ideas was that history was made up into gyres. Gyres. What's gyres? It's a Greek word. It comes from a Greek word like gyro, which means year, which is a revolution, right? And so, or a cycle. So there's a North Pacific gyre, which is it's like a whirlpool full of trash in the Pacific, right? It's the size of an island. So it's these cycles. So Yeats would say that history was made up into gyres or cycles of about 2,000 years, alternating between ages of spirituality and ages of secularism. Each cycle reached the peak of its excellence in the exact middle and then began to decay until it was finally replaced by a new gyre. And this idea was explored most potently in his famous poem, The Second Coming, where Yeats identified his own time, our time, as the end of a religious cycle, entering into an age of secularism, which we would call the Enlightenment, right? The end of the religious cycle of Christianity and then the beginning of a secular cycle, and envisioned the start of a new unknown cycle of secularism, which initiated by the coming of a great beast. So it's his apocalypse story. And so he would say, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The great beast, the last time such a cycle began, is the subject of Leda and the Swan. The rape of Leda by Zeus signals the start of the classical era, around 2000 BC. In each case, the divine visits the earth and gives a new baby for something to happen, right? And leaves the seeds of the new history that will form from this baby. This is the key to Yeats. And if you didn't know any of this, most of this meaning for his poem and what it meant to him would be absolutely inaccessible to you, right? So he said, did she put on his knowledge with his power? Right? And it's almost like he later glimpsed the future. She was creating the cycle. Did she understand that she was creating the cycle she was inaugurating before the indifferent God flew away in some way, right? He suggests the shape of things to come is contained in the origin. But can humans discern that at all? Or is it just like Leda? It happens quick, we don't know it, we're helpless to its coming, right? And this is all the stuff about his gyres. Are we like Leda in this instance? That we are helpless to the way that civilization will progress? And this is how Yeats addresses his mystical system. It isn't in any way scientific or even very specific. There's a real debate whether Yeats even believed any of this or if it was just a motif that he used in his poem. But he probably believed it in some way because it was clearly important to him to have a unified system to write his poems in the first place, much like Tolkien. And it was from the many symbols of this unity that Yeats was able to extract his strongest poetry, right? Wings, dark webs, breast, fingers, feathered glory, heart, loins, beating, bill, helpless, thighs. All of his strong imagery comes from the sliding meanings of his work that he wove throughout his past work. This is him editing over 63 years of his life. One symbol laying one idea into the form of the poem in the meter of a sonnet would make the rest of the web light up, and you understand what he's trying to get at. This is the complexity of poetry, right? He's reflecting on history through this ancient myth. And what became relevant for Yeats' own trauma is because he lived World War I. World War I must have come like a sudden blow by his posing questions of possible resistance. Could we have escaped this brutal act? But showing no resistance on the part of the world powers, later even possible, maybe even possible enjoyment on Leda's part, we are called to imagine how we resist the throes of history, how we pay attention. And so for us, as we read poetry in the scriptures, and as we read narrative poems formally and properly, the challenge for us becomes, how do we discern these symbols when we're not aware of the background? And so the task for us is to carefully and slowly march into Scripture. So here we are. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to read something to us. Now we're going to go into the Scripture. Okay? And then in the notes, you should have a chart, but I'm just going to read it to you. There'll be a chart that lays out this text, right? But before you look at the chart, don't look at the chart right now. We're going to just look at the story in Kings. So go to 2 Kings 4. Don't look at the notes yet. There's a chart, but we'll look at the chart later. I just want you to hear it read, okay? So this will recreate the frustrating experience that many of us have as we read narrative, right? So reading biblical narrative can be very frustrating. So that's why I want us to recreate this, the experience of reading. So this is a story about Elisha. 2 Kings 4. I'm going to read it. Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elijah, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Yahweh, and the lender has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go, request for yourself vessels from outside from all of your neighbors, empty vessels, do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and you shall pour into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full." Then she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her and pouring. It came about when the vessels were full, and she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another vessel." And the oil stopped. And she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go and sell the oil and pay your lender, and you and your sons can live on the rest." Okay? This is an amazing story, right? I'm not going to tell you what to feel and what to experience. You tell me, what does it feel like? Is it an action-packed story? By reckoning of action, it's not the most action-packed story a story could be. It could be a story about war. It could be a story about a fight. It could be the story of a death. Right now, it's the story of a man, right? Asking for jars, right? The biggest action is go pour, right? Go pour. And she was pouring. Okay, I get it. Oil vessels, right? Right? But this is vital, right? So the repetition strikes you as they're repeating a lot of things. Okay, a lot of oil's being poured. Go get the vessel. And he was pouring. She poured. Go pour. And she was pouring. And it came to pass that she poured and it was full. And right? Right? But so the repetition, right? The repetition, it should clue us into something. What's the real action of the poem? What's the thing they're trying to emphasize with all of the pouring? What's the accelerating action of the poem? I mean of the story.
Collecting jars, putting oil,
So
and then the jars are being filled.
So they're a family. They have jars of oil in the house, likely to cook, and likely to light the house at night, right? They have just enough, just a little bit, right? And so what they do is don't get a few jars, ask from all of your neighbors, borrow some jars. And then the action is that little, she kept pouring, and it kept pouring until all of the excessive amount of jars were full. And then it only stopped when there was no more jars, right? But also there's a sadness to the poem. Why? I mean, to the story. What's the sad part? What's at risk? Her children. She has to sell the oil in order to keep her sons. Right? That's the point. She wants to keep her children, and she has no money to keep her children. The lender is already calling on the debt, and they're at nothing at this point. Right? The point is she wants to keep her children, and so she's pouring oil so that they don't keep her sons as slaves, which is awful. This is Israel. Right? This is Israel. It's against the law to do this. Right? So this is from the literary form and the repetition, you probably sensed it, but there's a cultural difference, right? There's a cultural difference between us and now. What we're reading is the very modern reading of this poem, right? There's a trope in comedy films that have been coming out lately where you hear the narrator say, like, something happens, and then the narrator says, and Johnny was vexed, and Johnny was very confused, right? There's like a narration of a confusing act, right? And there's a little bit going on in this story when it says, go shut the door behind you. And then she went and shut the door behind, right? There's almost like a repeated action, right? It feels comedic to me in my cultural context because in our cultural context, there's sometimes this repeated narration is used a lot in comedic films, right? Even though she's getting instructions, she's driving the action of the whole thing, right? From beginning to end. So let's hone in on this. Notice the opening and closing of the scene. Think about if you were to create stage directions for a play or how to film this. Talk to me about who and where the action is. Where's the action?
Inside the room.
Yeah, who is moving the action? The woman, she initiates, right? There was a woman and she cried out to Elisha, right? And then she has a speech. Plot conflict. Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared Yahweh, and the lenders come to take my 2 children as slaves. Conflict. Husband is dead, the lenders come for the money, right?
Faithful servant.
Yeah, faithful servant. So what happened is death and debt slavery. Those are the problems, right? We've had a death. Now that leads us to the crisis of debt slavery. That's her speech. And then we get a response. Think the camera shifts to Elisha. At first, he's like, what? What does he say? Okay, what do you want me to do about it? What does it have to do with me? Right? And then what happens? Camera back to her. Right? At first he says, oh, what does this have to what do you want me to do about it? And then he maybe steals himself. Okay. What do you have in the house? Right? Camera back to her. Well, here's what I have. Camera back to Elijah. Okay, do this. And he gives her a precise set of instructions. And then where do we go from here? Then we leave Elisha altogether. We follow her into her house, and in the exact same words, do exactly as the prophet said, and what the prophet said would happen is exactly what happens. Do you see it? Then you get another dialogue. What's the next point of dialogue after everything that they said would happen happened? Bring me another one. There's nothing left. Then we're back to, she comes now and drives the conversation again. So she comes to the man. Notice the difference. What does she say? Yeah. Notice the difference. She comes to the man.
And he said, go and sell.
Well, she comes to the man of God. That's the difference. So he's called Elisha at the beginning, and he's called man of God, which is the standard term for prophet. And what are his words?
Go, sell the oil and pay your debts.
And pay that lender.
So that you and your sons
Oh, yeah.
can
So,
live on what is left.
yeah. And so, when did the lender first come up?
At the start.
At the start.
Creditors.
Yeah, the creditors, right? And so how did the story begin? Death and debt. How does it end? Your sons then live. Right? Yeah, right?
Debt and live.
Yeah.
Debt and debt.
Yeah. Begins with death and debt, and it begins with the payment of debt and life, right? And so even just on the plot level, this is a small narrative, right? You can see that this is a pretty ordered structure. So now you can pull out the chart or turn to it. It's on the next page. And all I've done is taken those camera cues and followed the patterns of repeated words. I'm going to read the story again and just follow with me. Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elijah, your servant, my husband, is dead. You know that your servant feared Yahweh, and the lender has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. Do you see it? Do you see the chart now? Right? It's with the A, B, B, C, A, B, right? And the lender has come to take my 2 children as slaves. Do you see? It's not poetry, but it has a poetic flow. This is page 78. So remember when we looked at the examples of poetic lines, and you could do contrast comparison sequence, right? And then you have short dialogue, male, female speaker. Elijah said to her, "What shall I do? Tell me what's in the house." And she said, "Nothing in the house except a jar of oil." And what follows is Elijah giving, a fairly detailed description. Do this, request vessels, empty ones, go in, shut the door with your sons, pour until full. And then what you get is a narrative of the fulfillment of his words. Go and do this, and then you get the narrative of him going and doing that, right? The same vocabulary as the command. This is so common in Hebrew symmetry, right? The speaker will say, go and do this, and it might be a long description, and then there will be a narrative of them doing exactly that, and it will just tell you that they did exactly that. It happens all the time in narrative. We might think of that as frustrating, but structurally they're doing something very interesting. We think it's needless, but in Hebrew literature, it's actually a structuring device. It's an invitation to okay, because they don't always do the repeated action, right? Sometimes they'll just say something, and then they did as they were told, and they don't extrapolate, right? They don't pull out the language of the command, right? So when they give you a whole narrative block of telling you exactly what they were just told to do, you're actually being invited, right? That's the point. So she does exactly what she's told to do. Then another dialogue. And notice that it's inverted order of the first dialogue. The first dialogue was male speaker, then female speaker. Then this dialogue is female speaker, then male speaker. And it's all about vessels. And then we end with death and debt being resolved with payment and life. So on a narrative structural level, we're just like, oh, brilliant. It's neat. It's a really well-crafted story, not just in terms of the content, but in terms of its structure. So it's all about our frame of reference for how repetition functions in stories. Think of how we did Psalm 29, the opening and closing scenes, right? Put them together in your mind, right? Death and debt is the crisis, right? Can I think of any other stories where debt, slavery, and death is on the forefront of your mind? With where debt, slavery, and lives are on the line? What other story in the Hebrew history, in Israelite history, is there slavery and death and lives being saved? Moses. There's a foundation narrative that ends with a meal, right? That these people have been doing for every year for a millennia. It's called Passover, and it's the celebration of how Yahweh brought them from death and debt into life and freedom, right? Redemption is the payment of debt. Why were they there? Because they were seeking refuge from what? Famine. Yeah, and somebody forgot, and now they're just eating our food? Put them to work, right? That's exactly what happens. And so who or what is the agent that brings the woman and her sons out of debt and death into freedom and life? What's the actual agent of the redemption?
The prophet's instruction.
Yeah, the man of God. And notice how much focus there is on the words of the man of God. Its obedience to the word of God results in a transition.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did the woman really understood what's going on? Okay, of course, the
No.
jars. And
Yeah.
and all of a sudden they have a jar full of
Yeah.
oil in their room.
Yeah.
However big is that house, right?
Exactly.
Is that the door? Is that the house?
Yes.
Or is there
It's ambiguous that she knew exactly what would happen when she asked Elisha to do so, right? She just listened to the prophet.
Give me another jar. There's none.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? And so when there's no more jars, the oil stopped flowing. So you can imagine what's the scene like. So obviously there's a privacy to it. Don't shut the door. Don't let anybody see what you're doing, right? Because maybe then your neighbors will want some of it and it results in bigger problems for you. but sell the oil, right? So as soon as there's no more jars, the oil stopped flowing, and she didn't know what to do. So what did she do? What do I, yeah, what do I do now? Yeah. Now sell the oil and then live on the rest, right? And so this is a huge thing. It's a huge motif in the form of the prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This thing of debt and then life by listening to the prophet. And so you get all of these new Moses figures who end up getting called the same thing, man of God, right? Or figures that are like Moses. And when people do what they say, there's variations of the theme. When people do what the prophet says, things work well. When people don't do what the prophet says, things don't work well. And when prophet speaks, oftentimes it's first person, right? I am Yahweh, right? I am come, right? This is what Yahweh wants. So there's a little mini exodus that happens in this story, right? There's a shutting of doors, right, that leads them into salvation. It's the life of the women and the sons that make the form of the mini exodus, right? And God doesn't make promises, and what we know in the form, God doesn't make promises with the command, right? God doesn't say, go get the vessels, do this, and then you'll be able to pay off your debt, right? He says, go do this, and then in the same way, he said to Jonah, God didn't owe Jonah an explanation for what he's going to do in Nineveh. He says, go and get up, go to Nineveh, preach to them. Go and do this, right? And they don't make the promise of what's going to happen. It's this participation where you actually have to go in faith and join them and do it without having all of the pieces yet. That's exactly where Abraham would fail. Go, leave the country, and I'll make you a great nation. Abraham doesn't have all the pieces, nor did he ever get to see all of the pieces, but he had to go in faith. Was it easy for Abraham? It was not. He failed almost constantly at almost every turn of the road, and that's when it went bad for him, right? That's where you get the offshoot families who are also sharing in the blessing in the wrong way, right? Because sometimes there will be a promise about what will happen, right? The fact that the incentive for doing this weird behavior is not given now contributes to what? Because there was no guarantee, there was no promise that was given before the command was given. Who does this characterize? What do we learn about the characters? Because there was no promise made and the command given and the command was acted out. Whose character does this expand? The portrait of the woman, right? It tells us a little bit about the woman. She went and did it to the T, right? And the narrator doesn't say, and she was full of faith and she obeyed and she was ready. Who's the servant that feared Yahweh? The husband, right? We don't know the faith of this woman actually, just the husband. Servant feared the Lord, but he was also laid up with debt and he died, left this woman. We don't know her faith, but apparently, what? The faith would have made her well, right? It's a narrative of her doing this very weird behavior, right? Have you ever been asked to do tasks that seem really tedious and you don't know why you're doing them? Right? Many of us have been in situations where we're asked to do strange tasks and we don't fully understand why and how willing are we to do it? Oftentimes we're not willing, or we'll do it for a little bit, but when it goes on for a bit longer than our patience can hold, we begin to make questions. Like, I don't see the point of this. It would be easier to do this. It would be easier to do this. It would be easier to do this. Is the woman desperate?
Yes.
Yeah? How desperate?
Yeah, he desperate to the point that she needs to do something because if not, the creditors are.
Yeah. Desperate to the point that she would call out to Elijah, cry out. But we don't know if she did this out of desperation or out of faith. It's vague. It's ambiguous, right? And that's the wisdom of stories like this in Kings, is that both you and I will be and have been in places where we're either doing things out of pure faith or desperation, right? But what is the thing that makes her well? The willingness to do it anyway, right? And she's desperate. She's trying to save her sons, and then he says, go get all the vessels you can, then go into your house and shut the door, and then pour oil in the vessel. What do we think? Is that a good thing? Do we think that, right? So imagine if you're in the woman's shoes at this point. Your sons are going to be dragged into slavery. You can imagine that the lender had already attempted, and she said, please, a week, one more week, right? Something like that, out of desperation. Okay, I'll give you a day. You have one more day to come up with the money, or I'm coming and I'm taking your sons and pulling them into slavery. And then you go and you cry out to a man of God, and the man of God says, just get all the jars you can, and that one jar of oil that you have, pour it into the other jars. How willing would you be to go and do it? Like, the actual ridiculousness of the request is what makes the character of the woman so compelling. It could not be fully out of desperation, because somebody who's desperate needs solutions fast. I need to know that I have assurances that this will get me in the end. So there's some measure of faith, right? And so never once does the prophet say, I feel really bad about your kids. Trust me, this is going to work. Go and do this. He offers no assurances. At first he says, what do you want me to do about it? Like, what am I can't, right? And this is one of 14 signs and wonders in the Elisha narrative, right? There are 7 stories of Elijah doing signs, right? Do you remember this? Yeah.
What is that? The woman's daughter and the woman who
Yeah.
gave her food when there is no food.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I think chapter
yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is taken up in the Luke narratives, right? Of the persistent widow. Give me justice. Give me justice. And then the man is not a knower or respecter of God or respecter of persons.
To your question about whether we are desperate or it's faith amongst us, I think none of us here have been in a desperate situation. Have we been in a desperate situation? Even our most desperate, we still have something in the pantry or something in the garage. So sometimes we especially those in America, because we're in America, there's so much waste that our desperations are actually desperation that we can say we don't have nothing. And that's why it's always a question whether when we are put on a test, really, who will stand up?
Yeah. The interesting thing about desperation is that you often don't realize you're being desperate when you're feeling desperate, right? You become on full reaction mode, right? That's when immense stress and cortisol develops in your blood, then you get really stressed and then you become full fight or flight. You're just on react, right? And usually in those places when somebody tells me to do something ridiculous, I'm like, are you crazy? Why are you wasting my time? Right? We don't get that in this story. What's interesting about the Elisha narratives is that you get 14 stories where these are really weak. You get 14 you get 14 stories there, that'll be better. So you get 14 stories where Elisha says, go and do this.
I will take a look at
Go and do this, and then you get the narrative block of, okay, I'll do it, right? And they go and do it. What's one? Take the fleece. Take up your cloak, right? Just really weird ones. Go bathe in that water, right? And that's exactly what happens. They do it, and then the narrator has collected 14 stories, and a number of them are doing exactly the things, reviving the dead sons, right? So Elijah becomes a new Elijah who is himself what? A shadow of who Elijah was supposed to be, who himself was a shadow of who Moses was supposed to be, right? It's the photo mosaic of Moses, the picture of Moses. The mosaic of Moses is actually a lot of prophets, right? And so Elisha is the new Elijah and the new Moses, and it's all contributing to the portrait of this man of God. So, and the message you get what's the message of the portrait of the prophet? What's the message of the portrait of the prophet?
The man of God.
Yeah. What is one of the messages that's being built off of these 14 stories?
Oh,
is that when you listen to the prophet, when Israel listens to the prophet sent to her, there is redemption in life. If they could only listen to the prophet that was sent, then there would be redemption in life and freedom from slavery. How easy was it for Moses to get the ear of the Israelites? It was difficult, right? It was very hard. And even up until the end, you've set us here to die, right? And so the opposite lesson being when they reject the prophet, then there is death and exile. And not because they're being sent to death and exile, but because they're already there, right? They're left, right? And this is the remembrance. And God heard their cries, right? And so it seems like a narrative with a little observation. It seems like just a short little narrative, but with a little observation. Once you back out and see how it's embedded in the larger stories of Kings and the larger layers of the plot, then it becomes a little story of the Exodus. Like one way that the Exodus is still continuing to be true, right? In the story in the life of one family. The assumption is you could pick up another story in Israel where God is also working, right? How many prophets were there in Israel at the time? The story begins with, this is the wives of the sons of the prophets. So there's many of them. Elisha's just one we focus in on, right? And that's when Elijah, that's where he loses his commission, isn't it? He loses his commission when he murders all of the prophets of Baal on the mountain, and he thinks he's the only faithful prophet, and God has to tell him, you're not. There's actually 7,000 north. Your brother Obadiah is there, right? How can you tell me that you're the only one, right? What are some other thoughts and observations just on this little story?
Yeah, acting on faith is difficult, especially this one. I mean, how can, yeah, I mean, he's asking that the creditors are there, and then all of a sudden you're asking what I need to do or what do you want me to do for you, and then all of a sudden, collect jars, pour oil, and probably during the process, probably the woman, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, you can imagine how you would film this scene. Like, she doesn't get it at first, and then she begins pouring, and then maybe it pours more than she thinks, and then she's like, what is happening? And then there's a sense of, give me another one. What does that mean? It's flowing. It's just flowing. It's just flowing, and she needs another jar. Quick, we need to catch this. And there's no more jars, and then the oil stops. Right? The assumption is that the oil was just flowing, and she wanted to get more oil, but there were no more jars, so the oil stopped. There must have been a little bit of a mess in the house, right? And so I can anticipate a question if I was talking to maybe somebody who's newer to the faith, or maybe they don't understand why the Bible is important, or they're just wondering, they're just curious. They would be like, okay, so what? So what that we did this chart? What's the point, right? And so it's a great question because while it is an important question, while it's an interesting story, some people will fail to see or not be able to see the significance of why it even matters that we think about this. And it really depends on the setting. I might not show this on any old Sunday, right? In a Sunday school class, right? I would just tell the story, right? I would just tell the story if I was doing this in a sermon. I probably wouldn't pull out the chart in the same way, right? You can just note even the sequence of events. But all the point is, what we're doing right here is we're dissecting the frog to see how it works. And, oh yeah, go ahead.
In my version, it says, "Don't borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors, even empty vessels." So that means that's the version. I was assuming it was empty,
Yeah,
but he said even empty.
yeah,
So even if they have a little bit of oil,
yeah. They're just borrow things.
and their neighbors were nice to have given the lady all
Yeah, yeah,
Because of the husband,
Ye-
family.
yeah. Right. So good enough standing. The community is nice enough to not question the strange ask. Right. What do they have cooked up their sleeve? But there's also an acknowledgement of it. Shut the door behind you. Right. And so there's just little details that are so easy to just pass by, but what we're doing is exactly what happens in pointillism, right? In pointillism, where like all these little dots, and up close it doesn't look like anything, but when you pull back, you see the point, right? At a distance, our brain is filling in the gaps and shaping it, and so we can make sense of the picture. And so when we read biblical narrative, because it's so condensed, it's poetic, it's in a different language, we're filling in the gaps already and we don't realize it, right? Because we're trying to understand the pattern. And so we'll miss little things like the characterizations, which are just small, but they carry a lot of weight, right? And then they're actually didactic. They teach us, right? And so for me, in some settings, it's necessary to point out things like the chart, because some people, right, some people really need to see just how crafted and excellently this is put together. There's also an aesthetic beauty and a neatness to a short story like this being so tight and concise and working on a chiasmic level, right? And so when I say that the Bible is always doing this, the next story is most certainly doing something like this, right? That's the point, right? And any setting in which we read the stories of the Bible, we're going to get a whole diversity of people filling in different gaps differently, right? And nobody's going to read the same story quickly and get the same conclusions, right? Not without really poring over and studying. And so I think there are moments and times to drill down, and there are moments where we have to let the story affect us, which is why I had you not read the chart before you heard the story, right? Right? It's very similar to, going to the symphony, right? If you go to the symphony, and I like listening to classical music, it's not my favorite music to listen to, but I like listening to classical music because it's beautiful. And you can go with a friend who has a master's in music theory, right? And then the way that they will experience the symphony will be so vastly different than my experience of it, right? It'll be at way different levels and way different backgrounds of music. And for me, I want to listen to beautiful music. For them, they want to analyze different levels of harmony and counter-harmony and change in form and motif, right? And then somebody with a master's in music might say, check this out, right now is going to be a movement, and they're going to go from this interval to this interval, and it will feel grand. And I will just say, wow, that sounds really nice, right? But there's a difference. But I can then, after the symphony, ask them, so what was going on here? Because it had a sense of grandeur, but there was discord. Why is that? And then they might be able to walk me through. We can parse out the differences. But there's such a difference between dissecting the music and just experiencing it on first pass, right? And the more that I listen, the more I will come to an understanding. So Joe is in a really interesting position because we are watching Game of Thrones for the very first time. And I've watched it at this point maybe 10 times, 11 times. I know the story back and forth. And then Joe and I are going to watch it, and he's listening to me pause it and explain more backstory, right? And then let him know this is the light Rains of Castamere. And Rains of Castamere means the Lannisters are usually going to do something very dangerous. But the Rains of Castamere is also used when Tyrion does something clever, right? And so it's not always used the same way. It's the variations on themes. And so I think there are different settings where it's appropriate to show and read Scripture in different levels. You don't always need to pick at this at a fine-tooth comb, but I think the moral of the story is to just let it sit and weigh on you. So, any questions before we close? I want to leave us here. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so this is a really interesting time, right? This is where Israel left their kind of early beginnings as a traveling nomad state to a full-on power in the world, right? They have kings. There's a split, right? there's a fracturing. All right, so Israel, right? Remember we talked about this is minority witness, right? So one part of Israel went one way and followed a tradition, and most of Israel, just like Yates said, 2,000 years of just secularism, or a different, like the history changed, right? And so now you have the old Deuteronomic law and old Levitical law that prevents, they're not respecting Jubilee, right? This would be solved if Israel would respect Jubilee, but they're not respecting Jubilee. The prophets are supposed to be supported by what? The temple system, people giving grain, but they've gotten too large. Were they supposed to grow this large? No, they were not, but they did, right? They got horses and palaces and kingdoms, and then they started conquering neighboring stations. That was all David, right? He expanded the borders, right? Right? He expanded the borders. And I think if you think, this one's a freebie. So in Scripture, waters are often talked about like people, right? So the nations rage and they crash upon the rock, right? So harsh waters can be like people. The Psalm of David will say, I'm drowning up to my neck in enemies, right? And they're pulling me down into the murky depths. And then Israel is being chased by the waves of Egypt, the chariots, right? In the story of the Red Sea. And then there's all of these narratives where God is the one who tells the proud waves to stop, right? He sets their borders. He says where the water can go and where it can't go, right? And actually, Israel's mountain region was a big and lack of proximity to water, to a river, would have really helped to hamstring Israel's growth as a nation. But they grew. They expanded their borders, right? Even though God told their mighty waves to stop, right? And so you have that you have this kind of idea that the prophets are now living in a very different world than was intended, right? And debts are being called on even servants of Yahweh, right? And so this is the challenge. And then you have it's the same problem that's happening in Roman Palestine, right? In Jerusalem, you have Jewish tax collectors who are calling debts on their countrymen, right? But not just their countrymen, but all of these people are going to the temple, right? They all follow Yahweh, so to speak, right? But then you have tax collectors and priests beating their chests and right at the temple and exercising their money. So very different time. Any other questions before we leave? So this was just a study in how repetition works in narrative and can really emphasize certain things. Very good. Any thoughts before we close? All right, I'm going to close this in prayer and then we'll head out. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and we thank you for this time where once again we get to study your word and look at structure and context and really get to exercise the way we think about Scripture and stretch those muscles to further develop the way that we read and read well. In your name we pray, amen.